times, why am I a men's rights activist? Why did I choose the men's rights movement of all things? Why would I choose this small, unpopular fringe group that nobody seems to like and that there really isn't any benefit into joining? Well, the answer goes back over 10 years when I really first started noticing inequalities and issues that affected men, and I started learning about things like different pension ages for men in different countries, and conscription, and the education gap, and all of these facts that I was learning about, all these disadvantages and discriminations that existed against men. I remember thinking, how come you've never heard about this in school? How come no one ever talks about this? How come whenever you hear about sexism, you only hear about sexism against women. You only hear about discrimination against women. I've never heard anyone ever talk about these facts about male discrimination or men being behind or male issues or boys being behind, any of the things that MRAs talk about. So I went online and I went to places like Yahoo Answers, if you remember what that was, social media, just various places, and I started bringing these issues up. And I got such vicious responses from people. And I was called misogynistic. I wasn't called incel because that wasn't really a big term back then. But I was more or less given that same kind of treatment. And it was very confusing because to me, I was asking perfectly reasonable questions. Like, hey, in this country, men are forced to work longer, or men are forced to join the military, or here in America, boys are falling behind in school and men are falling behind in college. Isn't that an issue? And the hostile reactions that I got were really confusing, and I couldn't help but notice that the most hostile reactions that I got were from feminists. And I don't like making the men's rights movement into an anti feminist movement, but I can't be honest without saying what I just said. The most toxic, the angriest responses I got to when I tried bringing up men's issues were from feminists. Not all feminists. There are some feminists that I've talked to, plenty of feminists that I've talked to, who are sympathetic towards men's issues. They just see things from a different lens. But it's not honest to say that feminists did not give me the most hostile reactions. That's simply what happened. That's simply me being honest. So then I found the men's rights movement. I found MRAs. And I started talking to men's rights activists about men's issues. And obviously, the reaction was very different. The reaction I got from MRAs was, well, clearly sympathetic towards men's issues because it's a men's movement. But what I noticed is that MRAs weren't hostile to talking about women's issues. And they weren't in denial about misogyny or sexism against women, and they had no problem talking about sexism against women, and they didn't make it into a competition. They didn't make it into a who has it worse so much as just comparing, look, these are the statistics right now, and men happen to be behind in education and or employment, and this is the data to back it up. But it wasn't about trying to deny the fact that legitimate women's issues exist. It was to say, well, when you look at something like the wage gap and you take college education into account and you take some of the more recent data into account, you see that young men actually aren't earning more than women at all. And men are actually starting to fall behind the workplace, and etc. And just conversations that were much more fair and much more balanced and much more rational. Whereas when I went into feminist spaces to talk about men's issues, it was very hostile and it was very toxic. And so it wasn't a very difficult choice for me to make. And in my decade plus in the men's rights movement, I've honestly seen one of the most rational, reasonable, fair minded, and equitable movements I've ever been a part of. And MRAs, by and large, are people who support equality and justice for everybody. They're accepting of people. We're against discrimination. We are against bigotry. We are against hate. And of course, it's not a perfect movement. No movement is. But my time in the men's rights movement has only reaffirmed my decision to be an MRA. And I always challenge people who are against men's rights activists, be specific and tell me, what do you think we're wrong about? What do you disagree with MRAs about? And they either have a complete misunderstanding and they say something like, well, you guys think that women belong at home and not in the workplace. And I say, well, no, that's actually false. We think that men and women should be equal in the workplace. Or they say, well, we understand that men's issues exist, but you're wrong because the way to solve it is by solving the patriarchy. And then I ask them to define the patriarchy, and then they tell me to read a long list of books and then kind of go away and the conversation stops. If you need to have someone read a book to explain something that you just described, then you don't really understand it. You should be able to give me a couple sentences briefly explaining what patriarchy is, how it works, and why it's responsible for men's issues. You shouldn't just say, read this book, and then run away. I'm sorry, but that's really not an answer. So, the reason why I chose the men's rights movement instead of feminism or instead of something else is experience and interactions. And it really is kind of simple as that.